Sometimes a simple act of kindness can change everything you thought you knew about your life. For Wade Larkin, that moment came when a 96-year-old widow named Esther Bellamy offered him her cabin for the winter. Wade had spent 40 years alone in these mountains with just his dog, Scout. He figured Esther was being generous to a stranger. But when he found old photographs of a man who looked exactly like him, he started asking questions. The pictures were dated decades before Wade was born. Then he discovered a journal in the attic, signed by Esther's husband Thomas, with entries years after his death in 1952. Strange lights flickered in empty rooms. Scout growled at things that weren't there. What secret had Esther kept all these years, and why did she choose Wade to uncover it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Wade Larkin had always believed that a man's worth could be measured by how well he knew the mountains. At 68, his weathered hands told stories of 4 decades spent in the high country of Montana. Each scar a lesson learned, each callus earned through seasons that would break lesser men. The deep lines around his steel-gray eyes weren't from age alone. They were carved by wind and snow, by squinting into blizzards and watching horizons for signs of change. Scout, his German shepherd mix, padded silently beside him as they made their way down the narrow mountain trail. The dog had been his companion for 8 years now, found as a half-starved pup during a particularly brutal winter. Together, they developed an understanding that transcended words. Scout's ears, perpetually alert, caught sounds Wade's aging hearing might miss. Wade's experience read the land in ways that kept them both alive. The autumn air carried the sharp promise of winter, that metallic taste that told experienced mountain folk to prepare for the long months ahead. Wade had spent the morning checking his usual winter camps, the sheltered overhang near Clearwater Creek, the abandoned mining shack above Timber Ridge, the small cave system he'd discovered years ago. Each had its merits, but each also had its drawbacks. The overhang flooded during heavy snowmelt. The mining shack had a roof that leaked in 3 places. The caves, while warm, felt too much like waiting to die. He'd been considering his options when Scout suddenly stopped, ears perked, looking down the trail toward the valley. Wade followed the dog's gaze and saw smoke rising from a chimney, not the thick black smoke of burning trash or emergency, but the thin, steady gray of a well-tended fire. Someone was home at the old Bellamy place. Wade had known about the cabin for years, but had never approached it. The mountains had their own code of respect, and you didn't intrude on another person's solitude without invitation. He'd seen the old woman occasionally, usually in town during the brief summer months when the roads were passable. Esther Bellamy, everyone knew her name, though few knew her story. She'd lived alone in that cabin since her husband died, they said. Some claimed it had been 20 years. Others insisted it was longer. As they drew closer, Wade could see the cabin more clearly. It was solidly built, constructed from local timber with the kind of craftsmanship that belonged to an earlier era. The logs were still tight, the chinking holding firm against decades of mountain weather. A wide front porch wrapped around 2 sides, supported by posts that had been carefully selected and shaped by hand. Smoke curled steadily from a stone chimney that looked like it had been built to last centuries. Esther Bellamy emerged from the cabin before they reached the yard, as if she'd been watching their approach. She was smaller than Wade had expected, probably not much over 5 feet tall, but she carried herself with the kind of presence that commanded attention. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her dark eyes held a sharpness that suggested her mind remained clear despite her advanced years. "Wade Larkin," she said, not as a question but as a statement. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. Wade stopped at the edge of her property, Scout sitting automatically at his side. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his worn baseball cap. "Didn't mean to disturb you. Just passing through?" "No, you weren't," Esther replied, studying him with an intensity that made Wade slightly uncomfortable. "You were looking for a place to winter. I can see it in how you move, how you're assessing everything around you." Been doing it myself for near 30 years. There was something unsettling about how readily she read him, but Wade had to admire her directness. "Winter's coming early this year," he admitted. "Signs all point to a hard one." "They do," she agreed. "And you're getting too old to spend another season moving from camp to camp, fighting to stay warm and dry." Wade bristled slightly at the suggestion, but before he could respond, Esther continued. "I'm 96 years old. Mr. Larkin, I didn't get this far by mincing words or dancing around the truth. You need shelter, and I have something that might work for both of us." She gestured toward the cabin with a slight nod. "Thomas built this place in 1949, built it to last, built it to house a family. But families don't always turn out the way you plan, and sometimes what's meant for many ends up serving just one." Wade noticed how she spoke of her husband in the present tense, as if he might emerge from the cabin at any moment. "Your husband passed some time ago, from what I understand. Official records say Thomas died in 1952, Esther said, her tone neutral. 3 years after he finished this place. Funny thing about official records. Sometimes they tell you what people need to believe rather than what actually happened." The statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Wade wasn't sure he wanted to explore. Scout stirred beside him, a low whine escaping the dog's throat. "There's another cabin," Esther continued, seeming not to notice the dog's reaction. "Up the ridge about a quarter mile. Thomas built it first before this one. Smaller but solid. Good clearing for firewood. Place has been empty for years, but it wouldn't take much to make it livable again." Wade found himself studying the old woman's face, looking for some hint of what she might want in return. In his experience, offers that seemed too good to be true usually were. "Why?" he asked simply. Esther smiled for the first time since their conversation began, and Wade saw a warmth there that hadn't been evident before. "Because places like that are meant to be lived in, not left to rot. Because I'm old enough to know that holding on to things too tightly just makes them slip away faster. And because," she paused, looking at him with that penetrating stare again, "because I think you might be exactly who that place has been waiting for." Before Wade could ask what she meant by that, Esther had turned and walked back toward her cabin. "Come up tomorrow if you want to see it," she called over her shoulder. "Bring your dog. Thomas always said a place isn't properly lived in until it has a dog sleeping by the fire." Wade stood in the gathering dusk, watching smoke continue to rise from her chimney. Scout pressed against his leg, still agitated about something. The dog's behavior bothered him. Scout was usually calm around strangers, but something about this place had him on edge. As they made their way back up the trail to their temporary camp, Wade found himself thinking about Esther's words. There had been something in her voice when she mentioned the cabin being empty, something that suggested it hadn't always been that way. And her comment about official records, what had she meant by that? That night, lying in his sleeping bag with Scout curled against his side for warmth, Wade stared up at the star-filled sky and tried to make sense of the encounter. He'd spent so many years avoiding human connection, finding safety in solitude, that genuine offers of help made him suspicious. But the approaching winter would be brutal, and his aging body wasn't as resilient as it had once been. More troubling was the feeling he'd had while talking to Esther, a sense of familiarity that made no sense. He'd never met the woman before today, but something about her presence, about the way she looked at him, suggested she knew more about him than a stranger should. Scout shifted in his sleep, a small growl rumbling in his chest as he dreamed. Wade reached out to stroke the dog's fur, finding comfort in the familiar ritual. Whatever secrets the mountain held, whatever Esther Bellamy wasn't telling him, the offer of shelter was real. And after 40 years of making his own way, maybe it was time to accept a little help. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks. Winter was indeed coming early, and it would be merciless. Wade closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind kept returning to Esther's words about official records and things that people needed to believe. In the morning, he would climb that ridge and see what Thomas Bellamy had built. After that, he supposed, he would find out what kind of story the mountains had been keeping all these years. The next morning brought the kind of clarity that only comes after a mountain night. Wade woke to Scout's gentle nudging and the sound of wind moving through the pines. The air held that particular stillness that precedes snow, and he could feel the barometric pressure dropping in his bones, an old injury from a logging accident 20 years past that served as his personal weather station. After a breakfast of coffee and jerky, Wade packed his essential gear and began the climb toward the ridge where Esther had said the cabin waited. Scout ranged ahead, nose to the ground, following scent trails only he could decipher. The trail was overgrown but still visible, suggesting it had been used within recent memory, though not regularly. As they climbed, Wade found himself thinking about Esther's strange comments from the previous day. Her mention of official records not telling the whole truth had stayed with him through the night. In his experience, people who spoke that way usually had reasons for their careful words. The cabin appeared suddenly as they crested a small rise, nestled in a natural clearing that provided southern exposure and protection from the prevailing winds. Wade stopped short, struck by the sight. This wasn't the simple shelter he'd expected. Thomas Bellamy had built something that spoke of permanence, of someone who understood both the mountains and the craft of construction. The structure was smaller than Esther's home below, but perfectly proportioned for the setting. Log walls fitted with precision, a steep pitched roof designed to shed heavy snow loads, and windows placed to capture maximum light during the short winter days. A covered porch extended across the front, and Wade could see a stone chimney rising straight and true from the back section. What struck him most was the condition. Despite Esther's claim that the place had been empty for years, it showed signs of recent maintenance. The chinking between the logs looked fresh, the roof showed no obvious damage, and the clearing had been kept clear of deadfall. Scout trotted ahead to investigate the porch, then suddenly stopped, hackles rising. A low growl rumbled in the dog's chest as he stared at the front door. Wade approached cautiously, scanning for any sign of current occupancy, but saw nothing that would explain Scout's reaction. The front door was solid oak, weathered but sturdy, with a simple iron latch. A hand-carved wooden compass hung beside the doorframe, its needle pointing not north, but toward the southeast, toward the valley where Esther's cabin sat. Wade lifted the latch and pushed the door open. The interior was larger than it appeared from outside, with an open floor plan that included a kitchen area, a sitting space centered around a stone fireplace, and what appeared to be a bedroom alcove. Everything was clean, dust-free, as if someone had been maintaining the place regularly. Wade stepped inside, his boots echoing on wide plank floors that had been sanded smooth by decades of use. Scout followed reluctantly, staying close to Wade's side. The dog's continued agitation was becoming more pronounced, and Wade trusted Scout's instincts more than his own eyes. The first thing he noticed was the photographs. They covered one wall near the fireplace, dozens of them in simple wooden frames. Most were black and white, showing people in clothing that suggested they'd been taken decades earlier. But it was one particular photograph that made Wade's breath catch in his throat. It showed a man standing beside this very cabin, axe in hand, wood chips scattered around his feet. The man was tall, lean, with the kind of weathered features that spoke of a life spent outdoors. He wore work clothes and a hat similar to the one Wade favored. But what stopped Wade cold was the face. The man in the photograph looked exactly like him, not similar, not reminiscent. Exactly like him, down to the particular way his left eyebrow sat slightly higher than his right, the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident, the distinctive shape of his hands. Wade moved closer, studying the image with growing disbelief. The photograph was labeled in faded ink, Thomas Bellamy, August 1951. Wade's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the frame from its hook. The resemblance was impossible to dismiss or explain. He'd never seen this photograph before, had never been to this cabin before yesterday. Yet here was his face, staring back at him from an image taken 17 years before his birth. Scout whined and pressed against Wade's legs, clearly disturbed by something in the cabin. Wade set the photograph down and moved toward the kitchen area, trying to process what he'd seen. There had to be an explanation, some kind of family connection he wasn't aware of. But Wade had no family, had been raised in state institutions after his parents died when he was 7. The official story was a car accident, though he'd never seen any records to confirm it. In the kitchen, he found more unsettling evidence of recent habitation. The wood-burning stove was clean, but showed signs of recent use. A coffee pot sat on the back burner, and when Wade lifted it, he found it still contained grounds that smelled fresh. A pantry revealed canned goods, with dates indicating they'd been purchased within the last year. Someone had been living here recently. But who? Wade moved toward the bedroom alcove and found it furnished with a simple bed, a wooden dresser, and a small writing desk. On the desk sat an oil lamp and a leather-bound journal. Wade opened the journal to the first page and found an inscription in careful handwriting, "Property of Thomas Bellamy. Begun January 1949. The entries that followed were written in the same careful hand, documenting daily life in the mountains. Notes about weather patterns, observations about wildlife, and occasional personal reflections. Wade flipped through the pages, noting dates from 1949, 1950, 1951. Then, inexplicably, the entries resumed in 1953. According to Esther, Thomas had died in 1952, but here were journal entries from 1953, 1954, continuing through the decades. The handwriting remained consistent, the voice unchanged. Entries from the 1970s discussed political events Wade remembered from his youth. Entries from the 1980s mentioned technological changes Thomas had observed during infrequent trips to town. The most recent entry was dated just 2 weeks earlier. The time has come to step aside. She's found the right one at last. I can see it in how she looks at him, the certainty in her voice. Wade Larkin carries the blood even if he doesn't know it yet. The cabin will serve its purpose again. Wade sank into the chair beside the desk, journal in his hands, trying to make sense of what he was reading. Scout had positioned himself by the door, ears pinned back, clearly wanting to leave. Wade didn't blame him. The implications of what they'd found were staggering. According to official records, Thomas Bellamy had died in 1952, yet here was evidence suggesting he'd lived here for decades beyond that date. The photographs showed a man who looked exactly like Wade, and now a journal entry suggested some kind of blood connection. But Wade's parents had been Michael and Sarah Larkin, not Bellamy. He was certain of that much, wasn't he? Wade stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Scout immediately moved toward the door, tail between his legs. The cabin, which had seemed welcoming moments before, now felt oppressive, loaded with secrets that Wade wasn't sure he wanted to uncover. As they stepped back onto the porch, Wade looked once more at the hand-carved compass beside the door. Its needle continued to point toward Esther's cabin, as if drawn by some magnetic force that had nothing to do with magnetic north. Walking back down the mountain, Wade's mind raced with questions that seemed to have no rational answers. The photograph was undeniable evidence of something extraordinary, whether it was an incredible coincidence or something more difficult to explain. The journal entry suggested that Thomas Bellamy had lived far longer than official records indicated. And Esther's behavior the previous day suddenly took on new significance. She'd known exactly who he was before he'd introduced himself. She'd spoken of the cabin waiting for the right person. And she'd mentioned that families don't always turn out the way you plan. By the time Wade reached his temporary camp, the first snowflakes had begun to fall. Scout immediately settled beside the fire pit, but continued to watch the ridge where the cabin sat. As if expecting something to emerge from those woods, Wade stared up at the darkening sky and tried to understand what he'd stumbled into. All his life, he'd believed himself to be alone in the world, without family or connection to anything beyond his own survival. Now he was confronted with evidence that challenged everything he thought he knew about his identity. Tomorrow, he would return to Esther Bellamy with questions that demanded answers. The approaching storm could wait. Some mysteries were more urgent than shelter from the cold. The snow fell steadily through the night, and by morning Wade's temporary camp was buried under 6 inches of fresh powder. He woke to Scout's urgent pouring and the realization that the storm had intensified beyond what his weather-reading skills had predicted. The wind howled through the pines with a ferocity that spoke of a system that would last days rather than hours. Wade's original plan to confront Esther immediately about the cabin's mysteries became secondary to basic survival. His lean-to shelter, adequate for fair weather, was no match for a genuine mountain blizzard. Ice formed on the inside walls where his breath condensed, and despite the small fire he'd managed to keep burning, the cold was seeping through his sleeping bag. Scout pressed close against him, and Wade could feel the dog shivering. The realization hit him with stark clarity. They needed real shelter, and they needed it soon. The mysterious photograph and impossible journal entries would have to wait. By noon, Wade had made his decision. He packed his essential gear, shouldered his backpack, and began the treacherous climb back toward the cabin. Scout followed without his usual ranging behavior, staying close to Wade's boots as they navigated the snow-covered trail. The storm had transformed the landscape into something alien and hostile. Familiar landmarks disappeared under uniform white drifts, and the wind created whiteout conditions that reduced visibility to mere feet. Wade found himself grateful for Scout's presence. The dog's instincts helped guide them when the trail became impossible to discern. When they finally reached the cabin, Wade was exhausted and thoroughly chilled. His hands shook as he lifted the latch, and he practically stumbled through the door with Scout close behind. The interior felt impossibly warm after their ordeal, though Wade knew it was only marginally warmer than the outside air. The first priority was fire. Wade had noted the stack of split wood on the porch during his previous visit, and whoever had been maintaining the cabin had left kindling and newspaper ready in a wooden box beside the fireplace. Within minutes, he had flames crackling in the stone hearth, and the cabin began to feel like sanctuary rather than mystery. Scout positioned himself in front of the fire, though he remained alert, ears twitching at sounds Wade couldn't hear. The dog's continued unease bothered Wade, but warmth and safety took precedence over supernatural concerns. As the afternoon wore on and the storm showed no signs of abating, Wade allowed himself to truly examine his surroundings. The cabin was remarkably well appointed for a mountain shelter. Someone had stocked it not just with basic necessities, but with comfort items that spoke of long-term habitation. Books, a chess set carved from local wood, even a small radio that picked up distant stations when atmospheric conditions were right. The photograph that had so disturbed him the previous day still hung on the wall, and in the firelight the resemblance seemed even more pronounced. Wade studied every detail of Thomas Bellamy's face, looking for some flaw in the similarity that might restore his rational worldview. He found none. More disturbing was his growing familiarity with the cabin's layout. Despite having been inside only once before, Wade found himself reaching for items in exactly the right locations. Matches in the kitchen drawer, additional blankets in a chest he hadn't noticed during his first visit, even a stash of coffee beans in a tin behind the pantry goods. Each time he automatically knew where something was. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran down his spine. Scout's behavior became increasingly agitated as evening approached. The dog would not settle, moving restlessly from window to window, occasionally emitting low growls directed at apparently empty corners of the cabin. Wade tried to calm him with familiar commands, but Scout remained on edge. As if sensing the presence of something Wade could neither see nor hear. Around sunset, though the storm clouds made it impossible to see the actual sun, Wade heard footsteps on the porch. They were slow, deliberate steps, the sound of someone moving carefully through the accumulated snow. Scout immediately went rigid, a continuous low growl rumbling in his chest. Wade moved to the window but could see nothing through the swirling snow. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then returned to the front door. Wade waited, hand on the fire poker, for a knock that never came. Instead, He heard the distinctive scrape of snow being cleared from the porch, followed by the sound of wood being stacked. Someone was replenishing the woodpile. Wade eased the door open and peered into the storm. Whoever had been there was gone, but fresh wood had indeed been added to the pile, and the porch had been swept clear of snow. In the white expanse beyond the porch, Wade could see tracks leading away from the cabin, but the falling snow was filling them rapidly. The tracks were large, made by heavy boots, and spaced in the measured gait of someone familiar with mountain travel. They led not toward Esther's cabin in the valley, but higher up the ridge, toward terrain Wade hadn't yet explored. He closed the door and stood with his back against it, trying to process what had just happened. Someone had known they were in the cabin and had taken care to ensure they had adequate firewood for the night. But who would venture out in such weather, and why hadn't they knocked or announced themselves? Scout had positioned himself between Wade and the door, still growling softly. Whatever instincts the dog possessed were screaming warnings that Wade's rational mind couldn't interpret. As the evening progressed, Wade found himself drawn repeatedly to the journal he'd discovered the previous day. He read through entries spanning decades, noting subtle changes in the handwriting that suggested the natural aging of the writer's hand, but no change in voice or perspective. Thomas Bellamy, if the journal's author was indeed Thomas, wrote, with the consistency of someone whose personality had remained remarkably stable over time. The entries revealed a man deeply connected to the mountains, someone who understood weather patterns, wildlife behavior, and the subtle signs that indicated seasonal changes. They also revealed someone who lived largely in isolation, with only occasional references to trips to town for supplies or rare visits from unnamed guests. But it was the recent entries that captured Wade's attention most completely. The writing from the past few years took on a tone of expectation, as if Thomas had been waiting for something specific to occur. References to the time approaching and preparations being made suggested someone anticipating a significant change. The entry dated 2 weeks earlier, which mentioned Wade by name, was not the most recent. Wade found 3 additional entries written in the days immediately following. Wade has seen the photograph. The recognition will come slowly. It always does with the bloodline. Esther grows impatient, but some things cannot be rushed. The storm approaches exactly as expected. He will be forced to take shelter here to begin the process of understanding. Scout senses the truth of this place. Animals always do. Tonight, I will ensure they have adequate wood for the fire. The cold must not drive them away before the revelation is complete. Wade closed the journal with hands that trembled slightly. Whoever had written these entries had predicted his actions with unsettling accuracy. The storm, his decision to shelter in the cabin, even Scout's reaction, all of it had been anticipated. Outside, the wind continued to howl and snow accumulated against the windows. Wade built up the fire and tried to convince himself that there were rational explanations for everything he'd experienced. But as he settled into a chair near the hearth with Scout pressed against his legs, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled into something far larger and more complex than a simple offer of winter shelter. The storm would pass eventually, and when it did, he would have to find Esther Bellamy and demand the truth about Thomas, about the cabin, and about why his face appeared in a photograph taken decades before his birth. The storm raged for 3 days, and during that time Wade experienced phenomena that challenged everything he believed about the nature of reality. Each morning he woke to find the fire carefully banked with fresh logs, though he distinctly remembered letting it burn low the night before. Food appeared in the pantry, not modern provisions, but preserved meats and vegetables that suggested someone with extensive knowledge of traditional mountain preservation methods. Most unsettling were the sounds. At night, when the wind died down enough to hear clearly, Wade detected the unmistakable sounds of someone moving about the cabin. Footsteps crossed the floor above, though the cabin had no second story. Doors opened and closed in rooms that didn't exist. Occasionally, he heard what sounded like someone chopping wood outside, but morning investigations revealed no fresh wood chips or disturbance in the snow. Scout's behavior grew increasingly agitated. The dog refused to sleep, instead positioning himself at different locations throughout the cabin, as if standing guard against invisible threats. Sometimes Scout would stare intently at empty corners, his tail wagging tentatively as if greeting someone Wade couldn't see. On the third evening, as Wade sat reading the journal by lamplight, he heard a sound that froze his blood, the distinctive creak of the rocking chair on the front porch. Someone was sitting there rocking slowly back and forth. Despite the fact that snow continued to fall and the temperature hovered near zero, Wade moved carefully to the window and peered through the frost-covered glass. The chair was indeed moving, rocking in a steady rhythm, but no one was visible. The snow around the chair showed depressions that suggested the weight of an occupant, but Wade could see nothing. Scout joined him at the window, whimpering softly. For the first time since they'd arrived at the cabin, the dog's tail wagged, not the alert, uncertain wag he'd been displaying, but the enthusiastic greeting he reserved for trusted friends. "What do you see, boy?" Wade whispered, stroking Scout's head. The dog pressed against the window, clearly seeing something that remained invisible to Wade. The rocking continued for nearly an hour, accompanied by what sounded like humming, a low, melodic tune that Wade almost recognized, but couldn't quite place. The melody carried a melancholy that spoke of loneliness and long years of waiting. When the rocking finally stopped, Wade watched as the impressions in the snow around the chair slowly filled with fresh flakes, as if whatever presence had been there was gradually fading away. Sleep came fitfully that night, and Wade's dreams were filled with images that felt more like memories than products of his imagination. He saw the cabin being built, log by careful log, by a man whose face he recognized as his own. He watched seasons pass in accelerated time. Summers when the clearing bloomed with wildflowers. Winters when snow lay deep and silent for months at a time. In his dreams, Wade saw Esther as a young woman, visiting the cabin with a small child whose features were indistinct but familiar. He saw arguments between Esther and Thomas, conversations conducted in urgent whispers that Wade couldn't quite overhear. Most disturbing, he saw his own parents, not as he remembered them from his childhood, but as they might have looked before his birth, standing in this very cabin and speaking with Thomas about matters that seemed to carry enormous weight. Wade woke on the fourth morning to sunlight streaming through the windows and the blessed silence that follows a major storm. The weather had broken during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by snow but bright with possibility. Scout seemed more relaxed, though he continued to watch certain areas of the cabin with unusual attention. After breakfast, Wade made his way to the cabin's small front porch and found evidence that his dreams might have contained more truth than imagination. Melting snow had revealed objects that hadn't been there before the storm. A child's wooden toy, weathered by decades of exposure, and a photograph pressed face down against the porch boards. The photograph, when Wade turned it over, showed Esther as she must have looked 40 years earlier. She stood beside a man Wade now recognized as Thomas, but between them was a small boy whose face, even at that young age, bore an unmistakable resemblance to Wade himself. Written on the back in faded ink was a date, 1968, and a single word, Samuel. Wade studied the photograph with growing confusion. In 1968, he would have been 3 years old, living with his parents in what he'd always believed was their only home, hundreds of miles from these mountains. Yet here was a photograph suggesting he'd been in this place, with these people, at that exact time. The implications were staggering. Either the photograph was an incredible coincidence, or everything he believed about his early childhood was false. Wade spent the morning clearing snow from around the cabin and thinking about the evidence that continued to accumulate. The photograph, the journal entries, his inexplicable familiarity with the cabin's layout. Each piece suggested a connection to this place that predated his conscious memory. By afternoon, he'd made his decision. The weather had cleared enough to attempt the journey down to Esther's cabin, and the time had come for answers. Wade packed a small bag with the photograph and several relevant pages from the journal, secured the cabin as if he planned to return, and began the descent with Scout ranging ahead. The snow made the trail treacherous, but Wade's mountain experience served him well. They reached Esther's cabin just as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. Smoke rose from Esther's chimney, and warm light glowed in her windows. Wade approached the front door with the photograph clutched in his gloved hand. Scout staying close to his side, Esther opened the door before he could knock, as if she'd been watching for their arrival. "I wondered how long it would take you to find that," she said, looking at the photograph in Wade's hand. Her voice carried no surprise, only a kind of weary resignation. "We need to talk," Wade said. "Yes," Esther replied, stepping aside to let them enter. "I suppose we do. It's been a long time coming, Samuel." The use of the name from the photograph hit Wade like a physical blow. Scout entered the cabin ahead of him, immediately settling by Esther's fire as if he'd been there countless times before. Wade remained standing in the doorway, the photograph trembling in his hand. "My name is Wade Larkin," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to himself. "That's the name they gave you after," Esther said gently. "But you were Samuel Bellamy first. You were Thomas's grandson, and you lived in that cabin until you were 7 years old." The world seemed to tilt around Wade as 40 years of assumed identity crumbled in the space of a single sentence. He gripped the doorframe for support, staring at the old woman who claimed to hold the truth about his past. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Sit down." "Samuel," Esther said, her voice filled with a compassion that carried the weight of decades. "Let me tell you about the family you forgot, and the man who never stopped waiting for you to come home." Wade sank into the chair Esther indicated, his legs suddenly unreliable beneath him. Scout settled at his feet, and Wade found himself gripping the dog's fur for something solid and real in a world that had just turned upside down. "Samuel Bellamy," he repeated, the name feeling foreign on his tongue, yet somehow familiar, like a half-remembered song. "You're saying Thomas was my grandfather, your father's father," Esther confirmed, settling into her own chair across from him. "Thomas never acknowledged it officially. There were reasons for that, complicated reasons, involving promises made and secrets kept. But Samuel Bellamy was born in that cabin in 1965, lived there until 1972, and loved that mountain the way children love the only world they've ever known." Wade studied Esther's weathered face, looking for any sign of deception or delusion. He found neither. Her dark eyes held the steady certainty of someone recounting established fact rather than constructing fantasy. "My parents were Michael and Sarah Larkin," Wade said, though the assertion felt less solid than it had that morning. "They died in a car accident when I was 7. I went into state care after that. Michael Larkin was a good man," Esther said gently. "He and Sarah took you in when circumstances made it impossible for you to stay here. They loved you as their own, gave you their name, tried to give you a normal life away from all this." She gestured vaguely toward the mountains visible through her window. "Away from what?" Esther was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire that crackled in her stone hearth. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of decades of carefully guarded secrets. "Your grandfather was not an ordinary man, Samuel. He was born in 1920, which would make him 91 today if age affected him the way it affects the rest of us. But Thomas Bellamy stopped aging in any meaningful way sometime around 1952, the year the official records say he died." Wade's rational mind rejected the implications immediately, but his voice emerged as barely a whisper. "That's impossible. I've been married to an impossible man for 73 years, Esther replied. "I've watched him remain essentially unchanged while I grew old around him. I've seen him survive things that should have killed him, know things he couldn't possibly know, and maintain a connection to these mountains that goes deeper than any normal human relationship with place." She stood and moved to a wooden chest beneath the front window. retrieving a thick folder filled with documents and photographs. This is the real history of Thomas Bellamy, the parts that never made it into any official record. Wade accepted the folder with trembling hands. The top photograph showed Thomas, in what appeared to be military uniform, standing beside other soldiers in front of a backdrop Wade didn't recognize. The image was labeled France, 1944. He served in World War II, Esther continued, was part of an advance unit that liberated a small village near the German border. What they found there changed everything, not just for Thomas, but for several men in his unit. Wade flipped through more photographs. Thomas, in various settings and time periods, always looking essentially the same age, despite dates spanning decades. There were documents as well, medical records that showed impossible readings, military reports that had been heavily censored, and correspondence between Thomas and various officials that hinted at arrangements Wade couldn't fully understand. The village they liberated had been the site of experiments, Esther said, her voice taking on the careful tone of someone recounting facts they'd rather not believe. German scientists working with forces they didn't understand, artifacts they'd looted from around Europe. Most of the villagers were dead, but there were survivors who told stories about what had been done to them. Wade found a medical report dated 1945 that documented blood work for Thomas and 3 other soldiers. The results showed cellular structures that the examining physician had noted as unprecedented and requiring further study. Thomas and his unit were exposed to something in that village, Esther continued, something that changed them on a fundamental level. The other men died within a few years. Their bodies couldn't handle the change. But Thomas adapted. He stopped aging, became resistant to disease and injury, developed an almost supernatural connection to the natural world. And the government just let him go? Wade asked, though he was beginning to understand the censored documents and official death records. They tried to study him first. For 7 years, Thomas was essentially a prisoner, subjected to tests and experiments, while officials tried to understand what had happened to him. In 1952, he escaped. The official death record was created to stop the search. As far as the world knew, Thomas Bellamy died in a hunting accident, his body lost in the mountains. Wade set the folder aside, overwhelmed by the implications of what he was hearing. And he came back here. He'd been born in these mountains, Esther said. His family had homesteaded here in the 1890s. This was the only place that felt like home, the only place where his connection to the land made any kind of sense. But how does this connect to me? How does any of this explain? Wade gestured toward himself, toward the impossible resemblance in the photographs. Esther's expression grew more somber. The changes that occurred in Thomas weren't limited to longevity. They affected his genetic structure in ways that the scientists of the 1940s couldn't understand. When he had children, those changes were passed along, not the longevity itself, but the potential for it. Wade felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. You're saying it's hereditary, in a way. Thomas's son, your father, carried the genetic markers, but never manifested the changes himself. He lived a normal lifespan, died a natural death. But you, Esther studied Wade's face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. You carry a concentrated version of whatever changed Thomas. It's been dormant most of your life, but being back here in this place where it all began is awakening it. Wade thought about his inexplicable familiarity with the cabin, his ability to find things without looking, the way he'd instinctively known how to maintain the fire and prepare for the storm. That's why I knew where everything was. That's why Scout trusts this place despite sensing Thomas's presence, Esther agreed. That's why you look exactly like Thomas did in 1951, and that's why the mountain called you back here after 40 years. The mountain called me? Thomas has been waiting for you, Samuel. Every winter for 40 years, he's maintained that cabin, kept it ready for the day you'd need it. He knew you'd come back eventually. People like you always do. This place is in your blood in ways that go beyond normal family connections. Wade stood abruptly, needing movement to process what he was hearing. Scout rose with him, pressing against his legs in a gesture of support. "I need to see him," Wade said. "If he's real, if he's been up there all this time, I need to talk to him." Esther nodded as if she'd been expecting this request. "He's been waiting for you to ask. But Samuel, when you meet your grandfather, be prepared for the truth about why you had to leave, and why it took so long for you to come home." The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made every detail of the mountain landscape sharp and immediate. Wade had spent the night at Esther's cabin, sleeping fitfully on her couch while his mind struggled to process the revelations of the previous evening. Scout had slept peacefully for the first time since they'd arrived in the mountains. Curled up by Esther's fire as if he'd found his way home, Wade woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and found Esther moving about her kitchen with the efficient movements of someone who'd been preparing breakfast in that space for decades. "He'll meet you at the old mine above Copper Creek," she said without preamble, not turning from the stove. "Noon today. It's about an hour's hike from the cabin, following the ridge trail." Wade accepted the cup of coffee she handed him, noting that she'd already packed a small knapsack with supplies. "You've talked to him?" "Thomas and I have been talking for 70 years, Esther replied. "Distance doesn't matter much when you've been together as long as we have." Wade wanted to ask how that communication worked, but decided some mysteries could wait for later. The immediate priority was the meeting that would either confirm or deny everything Esther had told him. An hour later, Wade and Scout began the climb toward Copper Creek. The trail was clearly marked but steep, winding through stands of pine and aspen that created natural windbreaks against the mountain weather. Scout seemed energized by the journey, ranging ahead with his usual enthusiasm, but checking back frequently to ensure Wade was following. As they climbed, Wade found himself noticing details of the landscape that felt familiar, despite his conscious certainty that he'd never traveled this route before. A distinctive rock formation triggered a memory of climbing on it as a child. A particular bend in the trail evoked the sensation of running down it at top speed. Pursued by someone whose laughter echoed through the trees, the memories came in fragments, disconnected from any coherent narrative, but carrying the emotional weight of genuine experience. Wade began to understand that his childhood in these mountains hadn't been completely erased. It had been buried beneath 40 years of a different life, waiting for the right circumstances to resurface. The old mine appeared suddenly as they crested a small ridge. It was a horizontal shaft cut into the mountainside, probably dating from the late 1800s when gold fever had brought prospectors to these remote locations. A weathered wooden framework supported the entrance, and Wade could see that someone had recently cleared debris from the opening. Thomas Bellamy sat on a flat boulder beside the mine entrance, and Wade's breath caught in his throat at the sight of him. The man appeared to be in his early 30s, though Wade knew from Esther's account that he was decades older. His face was exactly the face Wade saw in mirrors, but carried an expression of patience and sorrow that spoke of experiences beyond normal human comprehension. He wore clothes that belonged to no particular era: wool pants, a flannel shirt, and boots that looked handmade but well-maintained. Scout approached Thomas without hesitation, tail wagging with the enthusiasm reserved for beloved friends. Thomas reached down to stroke the dog's head, and Wade saw genuine affection in the gesture. "Hello, Samuel," Thomas said, his voice carrying the particular resonance that comes from years of mountain solitude. "You've grown into a good man. I'm proud of that." Wade remained standing, uncertain how to begin a conversation with a grandfather who looked younger than himself. "Esther told me you've been waiting for me." 40 years, Thomas confirmed. "Though waiting isn't quite the right word. I've been preparing for your return, maintaining the cabin, watching over things until you were ready to come home. Why didn't you contact me sooner? Why let me believe I had no family?" Thomas's expression grew more somber. "Because the kind of life I live isn't something you choose for a child. The changes that affected me come with a price: isolation, watching everyone you care about age and die while you remain unchanged. Knowing that normal human connections become impossible over time." Wade moved closer, settling on a fallen log that provided a clear view of his grandfather's face. "But you married Esther." "I married Esther when I was still essentially human," Thomas replied. "By the time I understood what I was becoming, we were already bound together in ways that transcended the physical changes. She chose to stay with me, to share this life, but that choice came with full knowledge of what it meant. And my father. Your father was born before the changes fully manifested. He lived a normal lifespan, had a normal relationship with aging and mortality. When he had you, we hoped the genetic markers would remain dormant, that you'd be spared the complications of our family's particular legacy." Thomas stood and walked to the mine entrance, staring into the darkness beyond. "But when you turned 7, things began to change. Small things at first. You stopped getting sick, healed from injuries faster than normal children, began to display an intuitive understanding of the mountains that went beyond anything you could have learned." Wade remembered the accident that had led to his placement with the Larkins, a fall from a cliff that should have killed him but had resulted in only minor scrapes. At the time, everyone had called it miraculous luck. The authorities were beginning to notice, Thomas continued. Questions were being asked about your unusual resilience, your family background, the isolated nature of our life here. We realized that keeping you here would eventually expose you to the same kind of scrutiny I'd escaped in 1952. So you gave me away. We placed you with people who could give you a normal childhood, a normal life. Michael and Sarah Larkin were good people who asked no questions and loved you as their own. The plan was for you to grow up safely away from all this, to live a human life without the complications of our family history. Wade felt a surge of anger at the presumption behind that decision. But it didn't work, did it? The changes happened anyway. Not in the way we expected, Thomas admitted. The dormancy lasted longer than we anticipated. 40 years, instead of the few decades we'd predicted. But eventually, the call of this place became too strong to ignore. You've been drawn back here because this is where you belong, where your true nature can be understood and accepted. Scout had positioned himself between Wade and Thomas, as if sensing the tension in their conversation. Wade reached down to stroke the dog's fur, finding comfort in the familiar gesture. "What happens now?" Wade asked. Thomas turned from the mine entrance, his expression hopeful for the first time since their conversation began. "Now you decide what kind of life you want to live. The changes are beginning. You've probably already noticed increased awareness, enhanced instincts, a deeper connection to this environment. You can embrace them and learn to live as I have, or you can fight them and eventually watch them tear you apart. And if I choose to embrace them, then you come home, Samuel. You take your place in this family, learn to use the gifts you've inherited, and help me prepare for what's coming." Wade looked up sharply. "What's coming?" Thomas's expression grew grave. "The same forces that changed me in 1945 are stirring again. There are signs that others like me exist, and not all of them have chosen to live in isolation. Some have chosen to use their abilities for purposes that threaten the balance we've maintained for decades." The implication hung in the air between them. Wade's return wasn't just about family reunion, but about preparing for conflict with others who shared their supernatural heritage. "How long do I have to decide?" Wade asked. "Take the time you need," Thomas replied. "But understand that the changes are accelerating now that you're back in this place. Eventually, the decision will be made for you by biology and destiny." Wade spent 3 days processing his meeting with Thomas, moving between the cabin on the ridge and Esther's home in the valley as he tried to reconcile 40 years of assumed identity with the reality of his supernatural heritage. The physical changes Thomas had mentioned were indeed becoming more apparent. His vision had grown sharper, particularly at night, and he found himself moving through the mountain terrain with an unconscious grace that would have taken years to develop naturally. Scout seemed to approve of these changes, displaying a contentment Wade had rarely seen in their years together. The dog's earlier agitation had been replaced by a watchful alertness that suggested he was protecting something precious rather than guarding against threat. On the fourth morning, Wade was splitting firewood behind the cabin when Scout suddenly went rigid. His ears pricked toward the valley below. Wade followed the dog's gaze and saw a black SUV making its way up the narrow mountain road that led to Esther's cabin. The vehicle moved slowly, carefully navigating ruts and obstacles. But there was something purposeful about its approach that made Wade uneasy. He set down his axe and moved to a position where he could observe without being seen. The SUV stopped in front of Esther's cabin, and 3 men emerged. Even at distance, Wade could see they were not typical mountain visitors. Their clothes were too new, their movements too coordinated, their attention too focused on the cabin and its surroundings. Wade was reaching for the rifle Thomas had left in the cabin when Scout bolted down the ridge, moving faster than Wade had ever seen him travel. The dog's protective instincts had apparently overridden his usual obedience, and Wade knew he had to follow. By the time Wade reached Esther's cabin, the confrontation was already underway. The 3 men stood on Esther's front porch while she faced them from her doorway, her small frame dwarfed by their bulk, but her posture radiating defiance. "Told you people 40 years ago that you'd get nothing from us," Esther was saying, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "That hasn't changed, Mrs. Bellamy," the lead man replied, his tone professionally courteous but underlaid with threat. "Circumstances have changed significantly since our last contact. Recent satellite surveillance has detected energy signatures from this area that match patterns we've been tracking for decades." Wade crept closer, using the tree line for cover. Scout had positioned himself behind Esther's cabin, probably waiting for some signal to act. "The subject, designated as TB7, has been living in isolation for 70 years, the man continued. "But now we have evidence of secondary manifestation, another individual displaying similar capabilities. Federal law requires us to investigate any emergence of enhanced human subjects. Enhanced human subjects." The clinical terminology made Wade's blood run cold. These men weren't here about property disputes or environmental concerns. They knew about Thomas, about the changes, about everything Esther had revealed. "You have no authority here," Esther replied, though Wade could hear uncertainty creeping into her voice. "Authorization 7 Delta 9 gives us broad discretionary powers in matters of national security," the lead man said, producing a document from his jacket. "We're prepared to offer compensation for cooperation, but cooperation isn't optional," Wade realized with growing horror that these were the same kind of officials who had held Thomas prisoner from 1945 to 1952. The agency or department might have changed names over the decades, but the mission remained the same: locate and control individuals who displayed supernatural abilities. "Thomas Bellamy escaped federal custody in 1952, the man continued. "That makes him a fugitive from justice, regardless of any statute of limitations. Recent evidence suggests he's no longer the only enhanced individual in this area. We need to speak with both subjects immediately." "I don't know what you're talking about," Esther said, but her denial lacked conviction. Wade saw the man signal to his companions, who began moving to flank the cabin. This was clearly a practiced maneuver. They'd done this before, probably many times. "Mrs. Bellamy, satellite imaging shows 2 distinct heat signatures at the cabin above this location. One matches archived thermal profiles for TB7. The other is new, but displays energy patterns consistent with enhanced metabolism and cellular activity." "We know they're both here." Wade's mind raced as he processed the implications. The government had not only been tracking Thomas for decades, but had developed technology sophisticated enough to detect the supernatural changes from orbit. His return to the mountains hadn't gone unnoticed. It had triggered some kind of alert system that brought these agents to his family's door. The lead agent stepped closer to Esther, and Wade saw her flinch slightly. "Ma'am, I need you to understand that we're not the only ones looking for these individuals. There are other parties with less benevolent intentions who would very much like to locate enhanced humans. Your cooperation with federal authorities is the best protection you and your family can have." other parties. Wade felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Thomas's warning about forces stirring again, about others like him who hadn't chosen isolation. These agents weren't just hunting Thomas and Wade. They were trying to reach them before someone else did. A new sound reached Wade's ears, vehicles approaching from the opposite direction. Two more black SUVs were making their way up the mountain road, but these moved with less caution, taking the curves at speeds that suggested familiarity with the terrain. The federal agents heard the approaching vehicles as well, and Wade saw their professional composure crack slightly. The lead man spoke rapidly into a radio while his companions took defensive positions around Esther's cabin. "Control, we have unknown vehicles approaching from the north. Request immediate backup and confirmation of other agency involvement in this operation." The radio crackled with static, then delivered a response that made Wade's blood freeze. "Negative on federal backup. All agencies report no operations in your sector. Recommend immediate extraction." Wade realized that whoever was in the approaching vehicles, they weren't government agents. As the first SUV rounded the final curve and came into view, Wade saw why the federal agents were suddenly concerned about extraction. The new arrivals weren't trying to hide their intentions. Men emerged from the vehicles with military precision, carrying weapons that were clearly not standard law enforcement issue. Their clothing was dark, unmarked, and their movements suggested training that went beyond typical federal agency protocols. The lead federal agent stepped back from Esther's door, speaking urgently into his radio. "Control, we have hostile contact. Unknown force, military-grade equipment moving to engage. Need immediate..." His transmission cut off as one of the newcomers raised what appeared to be some kind of energy weapon. A pulse of blue light struck the federal agent's radio, reducing it to smoking plastic and metal. "Federal agents," called a voice from the new group, amplified by some kind of speaker system. "You are operating outside your jurisdiction and interfering with a sanctioned recovery operation. Stand down immediately." Wade watched in growing alarm as the two groups faced off in Esther's front yard. Neither seemed particularly concerned about her safety, and both appeared to know exactly why they were here. A third voice cut through the tension, Thomas's voice. Though Wade couldn't see where his grandfather was positioned, "Esther, get inside the cabin and stay there. Samuel, I know you're watching from the tree line. These people are here because of what we are, and they won't leave until they have what they came for." Wade saw Esther quickly retreat into her cabin, but the opposing groups remained focused on each other rather than pursuing her. Esther Bellamy, the newcomer with the amplified voice, called out, "My name is Colonel Marcus Webb. I represent an organization that has been tracking enhanced individuals for the past decade. We offer something the federal government cannot. A chance to use your abilities for purposes beyond mere survival." "And Samuel Bellamy," Colonel Webb continued, somehow knowing exactly where Wade was hidden. "We know about your recent transformation, about the genetic inheritance that's finally manifesting itself. You have a choice to make about how you want to use what you're becoming." Wade felt the weight of multiple gazes searching for him in the tree line. Both groups knew he was there, and both wanted something from him. The federal agents wanted to control him, study him, probably imprison him, as they had Thomas decades earlier. But what did this Colonel Webb and his military-equipped team want? Thomas's voice rang out again, closer now, but still from an unseen position. "Samuel, whatever you decide, understand that this moment changes everything. There's no going back to the life you had before, no return to anonymity. The world has found us, and we have to choose how we're going to respond." Wade looked toward Esther's cabin, where Scout had emerged from hiding to position himself protectively by the front door. The dog's loyalty was unwavering, but this situation was far beyond anything Scout could help with. Three forces converged on this remote mountain location, federal agents seeking to contain supernatural threats, a mysterious military organization offering unknown alternatives, and his own family trying to protect secrets they'd kept for 70 years. Wade realized that his quiet reunion with his heritage had just become something much more complex and dangerous. The choice Thomas had given him about embracing his abilities was no longer theoretical. It was immediate, urgent, and would determine not just his own future, but the fate of everyone he'd come to care about. The standoff in Esther's front yard stretched into tense minutes as both groups maintained their positions, weapons drawn but not yet firing. Wade remained hidden in the tree line, acutely aware that any movement on his part could trigger violence that would endanger everyone, particularly Esther. Colonel Webb's amplified voice cut through the mountain air again. "Mr. Bellamy, both of you, I understand your reluctance to trust any official organization. The federal government's track record with enhanced individuals has been less than exemplary. But we represent a different approach. The lead federal agent, his radio destroyed, but his authority intact, stepped forward. Colonel Webb, you're operating without federal oversight in a matter of national security. Stand down or face charges under the Enhanced Persons Act of 1978. Wade felt a chill at the mention of legislation he'd never heard of. The government had been dealing with people like him for decades, creating laws and protocols he'd never known existed. The Enhanced Persons Act grants authority only within established parameters, Webb replied. This situation falls under international treaty obligations that supersede domestic law, international treaties. Wade's situation was becoming more complex by the moment. Whatever had happened to Thomas in 1945 had apparently created ripple effects that extended far beyond American borders. Thomas's voice emerged from a new location, and Wade realized his grandfather was moving through the forest with the same supernatural grace he'd noticed in himself. "Samuel, can you hear me clearly?" Wade wasn't sure if Thomas was addressing him directly or speaking generally, but he found himself nodding despite being hidden. "Good," Thomas continued, and Wade understood with surprise that his grandfather could somehow sense his response. "The connection between us is stronger now that your abilities are manifesting. Listen carefully. Neither of these groups has your best interests at heart." Colonel Webb seemed to hear Thomas as well, because he responded immediately. "That's where you're wrong, Thomas. My organization exists specifically to protect enhanced individuals from government exploitation while providing them with opportunities to use their abilities constructively." "Constructive for whom?" Thomas replied. "I've seen what your organization does, Webb. I've met others like us who accepted your offers. They became weapons, tools for conflicts they didn't understand, fighting wars that had nothing to do with their own values or beliefs." Wade felt pieces of information clicking together. This wasn't just about him and Thomas. There were others, enough others to form some kind of community or network. The supernatural changes that had affected his grandfather weren't unique, and various organizations had been tracking and recruiting enhanced individuals for decades. The federal agent spoke into a backup radio, his voice urgent but controlled. "Control, we need immediate extraction and tactical support. Military contractors on scene with unknown authorization. Situation deteriorating rapidly." Wade heard the response through the agent's earpiece. "Negative on extraction. Weather moving in from the west, severe storm system. Helicopters grounded for minimum 4 hours. As if summoned by the radio report, Wade noticed clouds building over the western peaks with unnatural speed. The sky was darkening despite the early afternoon hour, and the wind was picking up in a way that suggested a major weather event approaching. "Thomas," Colonel Webb called out, "the storm will complicate things for everyone. I suggest we resolve this situation before we're all trapped here together." "The storm isn't natural," Thomas replied, and Wade heard something in his grandfather's voice that made him pay closer attention. "Samuel, do you feel it? The pressure building, the way the air itself seems to be responding to the tension here." Wade focused on the sensations Thomas was describing and was startled to realize he could indeed feel something, a building energy that seemed to emanate from the conflict itself, as if the presence of multiple enhanced individuals in one location was affecting the local environment. "Electromagnetic disturbance," one of Webb's men reported through their communications system. Satellite tracking is getting interference patterns consistent with enhanced subject proximity. Wade began to understand that his and Thomas's abilities weren't limited to enhanced physical capabilities. Their presence was affecting the environment in ways that could be detected and measured, which explained how they'd been tracked despite their isolation. Esther's voice came from her cabin, strong despite the danger surrounding her. "Thomas Bellamy, you get yourself and our grandson out of here right now. I've lived 96 years without needing protection from government agents or military contractors. And I'm not starting now." Her words carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but Wade could hear the fear underneath her defiance. She was trying to protect them even at the cost of her own safety. "Ma'am," the federal agent called toward her cabin, "for your own protection, we need you to remain inside until this situation is resolved." "I'll remain wherever I choose to remain," Esther shot back. "This is my property, and you're all trespassing." Colonel Webb signaled to his men, who began spreading out to create a wider perimeter. Wade realized they were positioning themselves to prevent escape routes rather than to attack directly. "Thomas." "Samuel," Webb called out, "I'm going to share some information that might change your perspective on this situation. 3 days ago, our monitoring stations detected enhanced individual signatures in Eastern Europe, North Africa, and Southeast Asia. All of them appeared simultaneously. All displayed power levels far exceeding anything in our databases." Wade felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Multiple enhanced individuals, all manifesting at the same time. It couldn't be coincidence. "The pattern suggests coordination," Webb continued. "Someone or some organization is activating enhanced individuals with a specific purpose in mind. The federal agents here represent the old approach, containment and study. We represent preparation for what's coming." Thomas emerged from the forest, moving with fluid grace to a position where he could see all parties clearly. Wade was struck again by how young his grandfather appeared despite his actual age. "What exactly do you think is coming, Webb?" Thomas asked. "War," Webb replied simply. "A conflict between enhanced individuals with opposing goals. Some want to remain hidden, to live quietly as you have. Others want to reveal themselves, to claim a position of dominance over normal humans. And a third group wants to eliminate all enhanced individuals entirely." The federal agent stepped forward. "That's exactly why federal oversight is necessary. Enhanced individuals represent a potential threat to national security that requires careful management." "Management," Thomas repeated, his voice carrying decades of bitter experience. "I spent 7 years being managed by your predecessors. I know what federal management looks like." Wade realized he could no longer remain hidden. The conversation was about his future as much as Thomas's, and he had a right to participate in decisions that would affect the rest of his life. He emerged from the tree line, moving slowly to avoid triggering any defensive reactions. Scout immediately ran to his side, pressing against his legs in a gesture of support. "I'm Samuel Bellamy," Wade announced, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "I want to hear what both sides are actually offering before anyone makes decisions about my life." The federal agent turned toward him, notepad already in hand. "Mr. Bellamy, you're experiencing unauthorized genetic modification that falls under federal oversight. We can provide medical care, research facilities, and legal protection in exchange for cooperation with ongoing studies." "Studies," Wade repeated. "For how long?" "Enhanced individuals require ongoing monitoring to ensure public safety," the agent replied, not directly answering the question. Colonel Webb stepped forward. "Samuel, we offer training, community with others like yourself, and the opportunity to use your abilities to protect both enhanced and normal humans from those who would exploit or eliminate either group. In exchange for what?" Wade asked. "Service when called upon," Webb replied. "Protection of innocent people, enhanced and normal alike, from those who would use supernatural abilities for harmful purposes." Thomas moved closer to Wade, and Wade could feel a sense of connection that went beyond normal family bonds. "Samuel, both offers come with chains. The question is which chains you can live with and which cause you're willing to serve. The storm clouds had moved significantly closer, and Wade could feel electricity building in the air. Rain began to fall in large, scattered drops that suggested the approaching system would be severe. "Gentlemen," Esther called from her cabin, "I suggest you all find shelter before this storm hits. Mountain weather doesn't care about your jurisdictions or your enhanced abilities." But Wade sensed this was about more than weather. The storm felt connected to the emotional intensity of the confrontation, as if the conflict itself was manifesting as environmental chaos. "Thomas," he said quietly, "what happens if I choose neither option?" "Then we run," Thomas replied. "We disappear into the mountains and spend the rest of our lives avoiding both groups." "But Samuel, running means abandoning any chance of normal relationships, normal connections to the world. It means accepting that we're fundamentally separate from humanity." Wade looked at Scout, who sat alertly beside him, then at Esther's cabin where the woman who'd raised his father waited for resolution. He thought about the 40 years he'd spent believing himself to be alone in the world, and the brief taste of belonging he'd experienced since returning to these mountains. "How long do I have to decide?" he asked. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first serious raindrops began to fall. Colonel Webb checked his watch and spoke briefly to his men. "The storm will ground all aircraft and make the roads impassable," Webb said. "We're all going to be here together until it passes. That gives us several hours to discuss terms and reach an agreement that serves everyone's interests." The federal agent was speaking rapidly into his radio, trying to coordinate with his superiors before communications became impossible. Wade realized that the approaching storm had created an unexpected opportunity. Time to learn more about both options before making a choice that would determine the direction of his life. But it had also created a trap. They were all going to be confined to this small area until the weather cleared, and he suspected that the closer proximity would only intensify the conflicts between the competing groups. "Esther," he called toward the cabin, "do you have room for guests?" Her laughter carried clearly despite the wind. "Samuel Bellamy, I've been preparing for this conversation for 40 years. I've got coffee for everyone and enough soup to feed an army. But I'll warn you all right now, anyone who tracks mud on my floors will answer to me, enhanced abilities or not." The storm struck with a ferocity that transformed Esther's cabin into an ark surrounded by chaos. Rain hammered against the windows with enough force to rattle the glass, and wind howled through the mountain passes with a voice that seemed almost alive. Within an hour, the dirt road leading to the cabin had become an impassable river of mud and debris. Inside the cabin, an uneasy truce prevailed as representatives of 3 different worldviews found themselves forced into unwilling proximity. Esther had indeed prepared coffee and soup for everyone, serving both groups with the stern hospitality of someone who wouldn't tolerate poor behavior in her home, regardless of the circumstances. Wade sat near the fireplace with Scout pressed against his legs, studying the faces around him. The federal agents maintained their professional demeanor, but couldn't hide their discomfort with the situation. Colonel Webb's men seemed more relaxed, as if enforced waiting was part of their regular experience. Thomas had positioned himself where he could observe everyone while remaining close to the cabin's back door. Wade noticed that his grandfather's apparent age shifted subtly depending on the light and his emotional state, sometimes appearing as young as 30, other times showing hints of the decades he'd actually lived. "Since we're all here," Esther announced, refilling coffee cups with determined normalcy, "perhaps it's time for some honest conversation about what each of you actually wants." The lead federal agent, who'd introduced himself as Special Agent Martinez, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Bellamy, this is a matter of national security that requires—" "Oh, stop with the official nonsense," Esther interrupted. "You want to study my husband and grandson like laboratory specimens. At least have the courtesy to admit it." Agent Martinez shifted uncomfortably, but maintained his professional tone. Enhanced individuals represent unprecedented phenomena that require scientific understanding to ensure public safety. And how has that worked out in the past? Thomas asked from his position near the door. 7 years of scientific understanding taught me that federal scientists are more interested in weaponizing abilities than understanding them. Colonel Webb leaned forward in his chair, his coffee cup cradled in scarred hands. That's exactly why alternative approaches became necessary. Thomas, you've been isolated for 70 years. You don't know about the enhanced individuals who've emerged in other parts of the world, or the conflicts that have developed between different factions. Wade found himself genuinely curious despite the circumstances. What kind of conflicts? 3 primary groups have formed, Webb explained. Isolationists like your grandfather, who want to remain hidden and live separately from normal humanity. Integrationists, who believe enhanced individuals should reveal themselves and work openly with governments and institutions. And dominionists, who believe enhanced abilities make them naturally superior to normal humans. And which group do you represent? Wade asked. None of them, Webb replied. We represent the idea that enhanced individuals have a responsibility to protect both themselves and normal humans from those who would exploit supernatural abilities for harmful purposes. Agent Martinez spoke up, which is exactly why federal oversight is necessary. Private organizations like Colonel Webb's operate without accountability or legal constraints. Legal constraints that include indefinite detention and involuntary experimentation, Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made everyone in the cabin freeze, the unmistakable noise of vehicles approaching despite the storm. Through the rain-lashed windows, Wade could see headlights moving slowly up the mountain road. That's impossible, Agent Martinez said, reaching for his radio. The road should be completely impassable. Colonel Webb was already speaking to his men through a secure communication device. Report, who else is out there? The response came through static-filled speakers. Unknown vehicles, sir. Military-grade all-terrain. 4 vehicles, estimated 20 personnel. Moving with purpose despite conditions. Wade felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. How many groups are looking for us? More than I'd hoped, Thomas replied grimly. Samuel, what I'm about to tell you may be difficult to accept, but your return to these mountains has triggered something larger than a simple family reunion. What do you mean? Thomas moved away from the door, his expression growing more serious. Enhanced individuals are connected in ways that normal humans aren't. When abilities manifest or strengthen, others can sense it across significant distances. Your awakening here has sent signals that can be detected by anyone with the proper sensitivity. You're saying I've been broadcasting our location? Not intentionally, but yes. The strength of your emerging abilities, combined with our proximity to each other, has created what enhanced individuals call a beacon effect. It's probably what drew both Agent Martinez and Colonel Webb here, and now it's attracted someone else. The approaching vehicles stopped outside the cabin. And through the storm, Wade could see figures moving with military precision. But unlike the federal agents or Webb's men, these newcomers moved with an unnatural fluidity that suggested they weren't entirely human. Enhanced individuals, Webb said quietly, studying the movements through his binoculars. Multiple subjects, coordinated tactics. This isn't a rescue operation or a recruitment mission. Agent Martinez was speaking rapidly into his radio, but getting only static in response. Communications are completely jammed. We're cut off from outside support. A voice cut through the storm, amplified by some kind of sound system, but carrying an undertone that made the windows vibrate. Thomas Bellamy. Samuel Bellamy. You will come out now, or we will come in and retrieve you. The choice is yours, but you will come with us. Esther stood up from her chair with the determined expression Wade had seen her wear when facing down the other groups. Well, that's quite enough of that. This is my home, and I'll not have people making threats in my front yard. She moved toward the front door, but Thomas intercepted her gently. Esther, these aren't government agents or military contractors. These are enhanced individuals who've chosen a very different path than ours. What kind of path? Wade asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The kind that sees normal humans as inferior, Thomas replied. The kind that believes enhanced abilities grant the right to rule over those who don't possess them. Through the cabin windows, Wade could see the newcomers arranging themselves in a formation that suggested they were preparing for a siege rather than a negotiation. Whatever they wanted, they were prepared to take it by force. Everyone in this cabin represents something they oppose, Thomas continued. Normal humans who've learned about enhanced individuals, government agents trying to control them, military contractors trying to use them, and enhanced individuals who refuse to embrace the supremacist. Philosophy. Wade realized that the quiet mountain reunion he'd expected had become the focal point of a conflict that extended far beyond his personal journey of discovery. The storm that trapped them all together hadn't been an accident. It had been orchestrated by people who wanted to deal with multiple problems at once. The siege began with a demonstration of power that left no doubt about the newcomers' capabilities. Without warning, every electronic device in the cabin, radios, phones, even Esther's battery-powered clock, went silent simultaneously. The effect was so complete that Wade could hear the sudden absence of electronic hum he'd never consciously noticed before. Electromagnetic pulse, Colonel Webb said grimly. Focused and controlled. That level of precision requires either advanced technology or enhanced abilities we haven't encountered before. Through the storm-lashed windows, Wade could see figures moving in patterns that defied the chaos of wind and rain. They weren't fighting the weather. They seemed to be working with it, using the storm as cover while remaining unaffected by conditions that had trapped everyone else. The amplified voice came again. "Closer now. You have 60 seconds to send out Thomas and Samuel Bellamy. After that, we begin removing obstacles." Agent Martinez moved toward the window with his weapon drawn, but Thomas caught his arm. "Bullets won't help against what's out there. These aren't normal humans you can intimidate or overwhelm with standard tactics. Then what do you suggest?" Martinez asked. "We work together," Thomas replied, his words addressing everyone in the cabin. "Whatever philosophical differences exist between federal oversight, military contracting, and enhanced individual autonomy, none of us want to see supremacists gain control of this situation." Wade felt the truth of that statement resonate through the cabin. Despite their conflicting agendas, everyone present shared a basic belief in protecting innocent people from those who would abuse supernatural power. Colonel Webb was already issuing quiet orders to his men, who began positioning themselves at strategic points around the cabin. Thomas is right. Enhanced supremacists represent a threat to everyone. Normal humans, government stability, and enhanced individuals who want to live peacefully. What exactly are we dealing with? Wade asked, needing to understand the enemy they faced. Enhanced individuals who've embraced the belief that their abilities make them naturally superior to normal humans, Thomas explained. They've organized into cells across the globe, working to destabilize governments and establish enhanced individual rule over normal populations. A new sound reached them through the storm, not wind or rain, but a low harmonic tone that seemed to vibrate through the cabin's structure itself. Wade felt it in his bones, a resonance that made his newly awakened abilities respond with uncomfortable intensity. "They're using harmonic frequency to weaken the building's structural integrity," Webb said, consulting some kind of meter his men had produced. "Gradual controlled collapse. They want to force us out without killing us outright. Why not just attack directly?" Esther asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Because they need Samuel alive," Thomas replied. "Enhanced bloodlines are rare, and his particular genetic heritage represents something they value. They want to recruit him, not eliminate him." Wade felt a surge of anger at being treated as a prize to be won. "And if I refuse?" "Then they'll take you anyway and work on changing your mind," Thomas said grimly. Supremacist groups have developed very effective methods of persuasion for reluctant, enhanced individuals. The harmonic vibration intensified, and Wade could see dust falling from the cabin's ceiling beams. Esther's carefully maintained home was being systematically weakened around them. Scout pressed closer to Wade, whimpering in response to frequencies that hurt his sensitive ears. Wade reached down to comfort the dog and felt something unexpected, a surge of protective fury that seemed to activate abilities he didn't know he possessed. The temperature in the cabin dropped suddenly, and Wade realized the change was emanating from him. Ice began forming on the windows despite the warm fire, and everyone's breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. "Samuel," Thomas said urgently, "you need to control that. Uncontrolled manifestation will only make you a bigger target." But Wade found that the cold felt right, felt like an extension of his will rather than an accident. He could sense the enhanced individuals outside the cabin, could feel their locations and intentions as clearly as if they were visible. "There are 6 of them," he said, his voice carrying new authority. 4 positioned around the cabin, 2 moving toward the back door. "They're not expecting resistance from inside. They think we're trapped and helpless." Colonel Webb stared at Wade with professional interest. "Enhanced sensing abilities. Thomas, his manifestation is accelerating under stress. It's the proximity to other enhanced individuals," Thomas explained. "Being near them is activating dormant capabilities faster than they would normally develop." The back door of the cabin exploded inward with a sound like thunder. 2 figures entered through the wreckage, moving within human speed and coordination. Wade got his first clear look at enhanced supremacists, and understood immediately why normal humans would fear them. They had been human once, but their abilities had changed them in ways that went beyond the subtle alterations Wade and Thomas displayed. Their eyes held an inner light that pulsed with each heartbeat. Their movements flowed like liquid mercury, too fluid and precise for normal human physiology. "Thomas Bellamy," the lead figure said, its voice carrying harmonics that normal human vocal cords couldn't produce. "You have hidden from your destiny for 70 years. That ends now." "And Samuel Bellamy," the second figure continued, looking directly at Wade, "you will learn to embrace what you truly are, rather than clinging to the limitations of human morality." Wade felt the cold emanating from him intensify, and realized that his fear was transforming into something far more dangerous, the kind of protective rage that could reshape the environment around him. "No," he said simply, and the word carried enough force to make the cabin walls shake. "I choose my own destiny." The battle for Wade's future and the future of enhanced individuals everywhere was about to begin. The confrontation lasted less than 10 minutes, but those minutes redefined Wade's understanding of what he was capable of becoming. The cold that had been building around him exploded outward in a wave of freezing energy that caught everyone by surprise, including Wade himself. The supremacist enhanced individuals, confident in their superiority, found themselves moving through air that had become thick as syrup and cold enough to freeze their breath in their lungs. Thomas moved with fluid grace, his 70 years of experience manifesting as combat skills that belonged to no human martial art. He engaged the lead supremacist in a battle that seemed to defy physics, both figures moving at speeds that left afterimages in the air. Colonel Webb and his men, along with Agent Martinez, provided covering fire that proved surprisingly effective. Their weapons had been modified with ammunition designed specifically for enhanced targets, rounds that disrupted the bioelectric fields that gave supremacists their abilities. But it was Wade who ended the conflict as he watched the supremacists threatening Esther, threatening the people who had become his family. Something fundamental shifted inside him. The cold he'd been generating suddenly focused, becoming not just temperature change, but something approaching absolute zero, the kind of cold that stopped molecular motion itself. The 4 supremacists outside the cabin found themselves flash-frozen in positions of attack. their enhanced metabolisms insufficient to counter the sudden thermal drain. The two inside the cabin, caught between Wade's expanding field of cold and Thomas's relentless assault, made a tactical decision to retreat. They departed as suddenly as they'd arrived, leaving behind only scorch marks where their feet had touched Esther's floor, and the lingering scent of ozone that suggested abilities powered by forces beyond normal understanding. In the aftermath, as the storm finally began to clear and normal temperatures returned to the cabin, Wade found himself sitting on Esther's couch with Scout pressed against his side, trying to process what had just happened. "The cold," he said to Thomas, who was checking Esther for injuries she was too proud to admit. "I've never felt anything like that before." "Environmental manipulation," Thomas replied. "It's one of the rarer enhanced abilities, and potentially one of the most dangerous. The fact that you manifested it under stress suggests your capabilities may exceed what either of us expected." Agent Martinez was attempting to re-establish radio contact with his superiors, while Colonel Webb's men secured the perimeter. The temporary alliance forged by necessity was already showing signs of strain as each group remembered their original objectives. "So, what happens now?" Wade asked, the question directed at everyone in the room. Agent Martinez looked up from his radio equipment. "Federal protocol requires that enhanced individuals undergo evaluation and registration. What happened here tonight demonstrates the potential danger." "What happened here tonight," Esther interrupted with steel in her voice, "is that my grandson protected his family from people who wanted to hurt us. If that's dangerous, then I'm proud of dangerous." Colonel Webb stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Samuel, you've seen what we're up against. Enhanced supremacists are organizing globally, and conflicts like tonight's are becoming more common. We could use someone with your capabilities." Wade looked around the cabin that had become the center of his world, at Esther, whose fierce loyalty had never wavered, at Thomas, whose patient waiting had finally been rewarded, at Scout, whose simple acceptance had guided them through the worst of it. "I appreciate both offers," Wade said finally, "but I've spent 40 years not knowing who I was or where I belonged. I'm not ready to hand over those decisions to someone else, no matter how good their intentions." Thomas smiled, and Wade saw approval in his grandfather's expression. "What will you do?" Wade stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountain landscape that had called him home. The storm was clearing, revealing stars that seemed impossibly bright in the thin air. "I'm going to learn," Wade said. "Learn about these abilities, about our family history, about the responsibilities that come with what we are. And then I'm going to decide for myself how to use what I've been given." "And if the supremacists return?" Agent Martinez asked. "Then they'll find us ready," Wade replied. "But this time we'll be the ones choosing when and how to engage." Colonel Webb nodded with professional respect. "If you change your mind about needing allies, you know how to reach us. Same goes for federal support," Agent Martinez added, though his tone suggested he expected a negative response. Over the following days, as various government and military personnel departed the mountain and life settled into a new rhythm, Wade began to understand what his future might look like. He would spend the winter learning from Thomas, mastering abilities that had been dormant for 40 years. Esther would teach him about the family history he'd never known, filling in gaps that explained so much about his sense of displacement in the normal world. Scout adapted to their new life with the easy acceptance that dogs brought to all circumstances. As long as his people were together and safe, the cabin on the ridge became home in a way that nowhere else had ever been. Wade found that he could sense Thomas's presence even when his grandfather was miles away, and understood that the connection between enhanced individuals went deeper than shared genetics. It was a fundamental recognition of kinship that transcended normal family bonds. Spring would bring new challenges. The supremacist threat hadn't disappeared, and Wade suspected that other enhanced individuals would eventually find their way to these mountains, drawn by the same beacon effect that had caused so much trouble. But for now, In the quiet of mountain winter, Wade Larkin, Samuel Bellamy, had finally found his place in the world. He had family, purpose, and abilities that could protect the things he valued most. Most importantly, he had choice. After 40 years of drift and uncertainty, he could finally decide for himself what kind of man he wanted to be and what kind of legacy he wanted to leave. The mountains had called him home, and he had answered. Everything else would follow from that fundamental decision. Outside his window, snow fell softly on the peaks that had watched over his family for generations. And Wade understood that he was exactly where he belonged.